from the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
It is a privilege to welcome you to the fifth week of our special series entitled Journey Through Time, What Happened in the Western World in the Second Millennium. On today's program, we have as our subtopic the world of democracy, the emancipation of the disenfranchised. As we do this Chautauqua Society performance on the television program as well as at North Idaho College, we're having famous people from history to visit with us from the past. Today, it's our pleasure to welcome to our program the very distinguished First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, who lived from 1884 until 1962. She was the First Lady from 1933 to 1945 when her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was our president. She was an activist for social justice and civil rights. She had a radio program that she hosted. She was author of a daily newspaper column titled My Day. She also was the United States delegate to the United Nations from 1945 to 52, and again 1961 to 62. And one of her great accomplishments was that she chaired the commission that drafted the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She also authored works and the autobiography of Eleanor Roosevelt, and This I Remember. Our distinguished guest is portrayed by a humanist and someone from the arts and humanities by the name of Susan Jarvis King, who's back with us for a second year. She was with us last year in another role and is a very gifted person. She is assistant professor of English at Tulsa Community College. She also holds a BA in humanities from Oklahoma State University and MA in English from Oklahoma State University. In her Chautauqua performances, she does a number of characters and has appeared in many different situations. She has been commissioned also by the Roosevelt family to do this role. And so we stay enrolled. Miss Eleanor Roosevelt, welcome to our program. We're honored to have you to come to our time in 1999 to discuss your life.
Well, I'm most happy to be here.
And we're so pleased to have our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in our time in Idaho, and she'll commence the questioning with our First Lady.
In our time, you're one of the most revered women, and we understand that you were a very shy person as a child, that you developed as you grew older, and it must have been a wonderful experience to be noticed by your dashing cousin Franklin. Can you share with our viewers in our time some of the things about your childhood that were most influential in your development?
Well, as you allude to, I really had a most difficult childhood. Probably the most important fact is that I lost my parents when I was very young. My mother died when I was only 8, and my father when I was 10, and that was most painful for me. Also, then I lived with my grandmother Hall, and I think really I was a very timid child. I was afraid of the dark. I was afraid of mice. I was afraid of practically everything. I also understood, as I think really only a very young girl can, that I did not have the looks of my aunts or my beautiful mother. My mother was considered one of the most beautiful women in New York. I, however, was an ugly duckling. And because of this, I think I faced my fears as a child and did a great many things that most people would not do in order to win the attention and the affection that I craved.
Where did you go to school? How were you educated? Or what schools were influential in your development?
Well, certainly the most important years of my life, I think, and really I might say to both of you the happiest, were when I went to Allenswood School in England. My grandmother knew that my parents had often talked of my going there. And so some of my aunts on my father's side did speak to her about sending me there. And so when I was 15, I traveled to England, and there I met my very great teacher, Mademoiselle Marie Souvestre. She was a free thinker, and I think if my grandmother had known the kinds of things I was being taught and allowed to do. I remember once Mademoiselle Souvestre had me plan a trip to Paris for the two of us, and I had to arrange all of the trains and the boats and the hotel accommodations. And when we arrived, I was allowed to go out into the streets of Paris alone in the afternoon while Mademoiselle Souvestre rested, and I think my grandmother wouldn't have approved of that at all. She probably would have forced me to come home right away. But I learned a great deal about the world. And also, I studied many subjects. We read many books and novels. And I also studied languages, and I do speak several languages as a result of my early schooling and my time at Allenswood School. I really wanted to stay on, but grandmother insisted that I return to America and make my debut into society.
And you attracted the attention of Franklin.
Yes, I did.
And what do you think attracted him to you?
Well, I think I was not like the other girls that he knew. I believe I was different in many ways. I think partly because of the influence of my teacher. But I was interested in many things, and I can tell you one day I was a member of the Junior League in New York, and I was working at the Rivington Street Settlement House. And I went there every day through public transportation. I always made sure that I arrived on the streetcar, although many of my friends were brought in their private carriages. And I taught calisthenics to the young girls who came there. And one day Franklin came to collect me. And I told him that I wasn't ready to go yet because I had to take one of the children in my class home, and she was ill. And Franklin offered to go with us. And so we took the child to a nearby slum area, and we walked up the 3 flights of stairs to the tenement rooms where the family lived. It was not a pleasant place, and Franklin looked around in surprise and in horror. You see, I don't think Franklin had ever really seen a slum before. And when we got back to the street, he drew a deep breath of fresh air. "My God," he said, "I didn't know that people lived like that." And so I think really I might have exposed Franklin to a part of the world and a way of looking at the world. But he understood, as I do, that the world cannot be understood from a single point of view.
You both came from New York, and you both were Roosevelt even before the marriage.
Oh, yes, that's quite true.
And the Roosevelt families were very prominent and continue to be so. Many people have said that after your marriage and that you became a team, a partnership, that often it's thought that maybe Franklin Delano Roosevelt would not have been president without you, and certainly would not have succeeded the way that he did, and the only person to ever be elected president of the United States 4 times without you. It's even been described that you were his ears and his eyes as you traveled the country because of some disability he had, polio. Would you address those comments? And I know that you might be somewhat modest about it, but you certainly can be described as the most dramatic and influential First Lady of our history.
Oh, I think really I'm just plain, ordinary Mrs. Roosevelt. But it is true that Franklin was a great influence upon me. As you mentioned, because it was so difficult for him to travel about, I did become his eyes and ears to the world. But he trained me in observing what I saw, and he always would say, now when you go into a school or to a hospital, don't just look at the menu and see what's being served. Go into the kitchens and lift the lids on the pots so that you can see what is really being cooked. And then when I would come back, he would ask me many, many questions about what I had seen. And so I think he really taught me how to observe the world. But you're quite right that we did do a great many things together. And I think we began to depend upon each other in a very real way. Because he could not walk, I was required to do a great many things that most wives would expect their husbands to do, and our way of living is centered on his needs.
It is often said in the political science arena that people in public life, some of them are great communicators with the public but not very good administrators, and others are very effective administrators but not very good communicators. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had both talents, and it often explains where he's been placed in history as the person closest to him. How would you comment on that? How would you explain that, with his radio chats and how he could communicate, how he could rally people, but also such an extensive program bringing us out of the Great Depression, getting us through World War II. That all took a toll on him and might have hastened his death, but explain his personality, his character.
Well, you know, it's very odd you would ask me that question, because Adlai Stevenson once asked me the very same question. He said, you and Franklin had very much the same background as I did, and yet both of you seem to be able to talk to the people and to understand them and to make them understand you better than I. What is it that makes the difference? And it is true that Franklin was able to really talk to people and to get a feel for what they were thinking and what they wanted. And I gave Mr. Stevenson the advice that he should get a small car and drive around in various parts of the country. This is very often what Franklin did. And stay in one place until he could understand what the people were thinking and what they were feeling. And try to really connect with the people. And I think this was very good for Franklin because he seemed to get a kind of power from talking to the people. It was most important to him. And I think really Mr. Truman was very much the same way. He was able to talk to people and understand them in a way that many other politicians have not connected with the people at all. I think really that's the problem with the Republicans, because they are, on the whole, still mainly a party of businessmen, and they aren't really concerned with the social issues that Franklin and I have found so very important. I only hope that we can return to those issues and with all of the enthusiasm that we had before the war. And I think really that's the great mission of politics in our time, is to return to the social issues.
Janelle Burke.
In our time, there are many people who are very interested in the Great Depression, and your husband first became president during the Great Depression, or right following the time when there had been a stock market crash. Many people in our time might even have been alive. Among our viewers, there might be people who were alive at that time. What was it like to take office at that particular time, and how did he decide upon various programs that he believed would bring the country through the Great Depression?
Well, I believe that Franklin always felt that people really wanted to work, and he understood that if he could offer programs that would allow people to work for themselves, that would be a very great thing. And that is really what he set about to do. And I felt very strongly about it as well. And I've always argued that we should not hold back any particular segment of our population. That is why I've never really understood why we have spent so much time discussing how to extend equal rights to all the citizens of our country. And you may remember that Franklin felt that everyone in our country should have 4 freedoms, that we should all have the freedom of speech and freedom of religion, but also we should have freedom from want, and that we should not have anyone in our country who needed the basic elements of life, and also the freedom from fear, that no one should have to live in fear. And I think perhaps those 4 freedoms form the basis of many, many of his ideas and his social programs.
What programs were you most proud of?
Well, I myself, of course, was most interested in the youth of America. I felt that if we did not involve the youth in our government and in deciding many of our policies and ideas, that would be a very great mistake. Of course, I think a great many people, particularly in the Senate and the Congress of our country, very much resented my becoming involved in this way. And through programs such as the National Youth Administration, we tried to make sure that those voices were heard. And I think that is most important. For if we do not teach the young people of our country to make up their own minds, someone will do it for them. And I don't think any of us really want that.
As Tony has indicated, many people in our time and in your time believed that you were the eyes and ears for your husband, who was not always able to travel and go to various places. What kinds of things did you tell him when you returned? What kinds of things were you looking for? And what are some of the most important things that you think you told him that later directly influenced a decision?
Well, certainly I think Franklin made mistakes. And I very often told him about those mistakes. I'm afraid that he didn't always appreciate my encouragement in certain directions. I know I very often thought that perhaps Franklin would have been happier with a wife who was completely uncritical. But that was something I was never able to be. And I think that one of the most serious mistakes that he made was the internment of the Japanese Americans. And I was very, very much against that. And I spoke to him on this subject, but as you know, during the war years, he was influenced more by military advisors. And I really think that I had less influence on him during that time. Although I never stopped trying, you understand.
What did you tell him about the Japanese who had been interned after you had been to visit them?
I did visit, you're quite right. And I went back home and I said to him, well, Franklin, they are all, I think, well cared for. They are dry, they are warm, they have food, but to Franklin, they are not free. And I think really that struck a chord in him at that point, because he really never wanted to take anyone's freedom away. And I hope that that is the time that he began to turn away from that way of thinking, and gradually some of the men were allowed to join the military and to fight. So I hope that perhaps in a small way I had an influence upon him. But I will tell you one secret about how I reached him during those years, because it was very difficult. I would have to stand in line with everyone else to get in to see him. But I learned that the best way would be to find him when he was swimming. In the late afternoon, he always went for a swim, and so I would put on my bathing suit, and I would get into the pool with him, and I would swim up and down, and I would say, now, Franklin, I think you should meet with so-and-so and such a person. I think you should do this or that. I don't think Franklin enjoyed that very much, but it was a time that I could have him to myself.
Both during your years as First Lady, Mrs. Roosevelt, and also afterwards, you certainly have been recorded in history as a person who championed rights of others that we would certainly label as civil rights. How much of that came from your own training, your own education, your own essence of who you were as a person, and were you also influenced by Franklin D. Roosevelt as you influenced him? I just would love to hear more about this passion that I sense you had for the rights of people, and there's some very touching stories of how you assisted in bringing people to Washington, D.C. who had been left out of the system or were denied to use their great talents.
I've always felt that I was an ordinary woman, and for many years I was a wife and mother, and I really didn't concern myself with politics. I'm sorry to tell you that I didn't even really think that women should be given the vote. But of course, when Franklin decided that he thought they should, I felt that I must follow his example. And of course, in the 1920s, I was very active in the League of Women Voters. That was an organization that I very much approved of. But I will say that I believe I have gradually developed into the kind of person that I am. For many years, I felt that a kind of gradualism in terms of civil rights would serve. But it soon became apparent to me that it would not. And I'm afraid I broke from many people, including my dear friend Adelaide Stevenson, who felt that gradualism was the best course in this particular issue. I finally came to the conclusion that there could be nothing gradual about it. But part of that came from my experience in politics and how it works. And also, I think I am not a very patient person, and perhaps that too made me feel that certain issues must be pushed forward more quickly because there are so many people who would try to hold them back.
Hubert Humphrey was in the same camp that you were. He really insisted on lots of issues concerning civil rights and influenced President Truman in 1948 and caused the other ticket that was with Senator Strom Thurmond, who walked out of the convention. Yet you were such a great friend of Adlai Stevenson and supported him in his campaigns, even when he might run against the Kennedys, or against John Kennedy. Give us a little more insight to that. Were you very close to Hubert Humphrey because he was, like yourself, impatient and rightly so, wishing for legislation faster than it passed? And by the way, may I have a footnote? We had the pleasure of having Senator Hubert Humphrey here at this institution after he was Vice President of the United States and had run for president.
I really think that in Mr. Humphrey, I saw the glimmer of greatness. I believe he would have made a very good president. Mr. Truman, however, I found in 1948 I had little enthusiasm for him. He had been such a weak and vacillating person and had made some very poor appointments in his cabinet and entourage. And I wrote to him at the time and I said, "Dear sir, if we think that we can elect a Democrat by appealing to the conservatives, I think we are quite wrong. If the people of this country are going to elect a conservative, then it is going to be a Republican, and we might as well make up our minds to it." In the end, he improved somewhat. And so I was able to send him a telegram in which I said, "I'm unqualifiedly for you as the Democratic nominee for president." But I don't believe that he was a true liberal in the way that Mr. Humphrey was. And I think really that Mr. Stevenson put his finger on his own weakness when he asked me that question that I described to you, that he was never really able to connect with the people. As to Mr. Kennedy, when he wished to be the party's nominee for vice president in 1956, he sent one of his friends to me to ask for my support, and I said I could not give it because I felt that he had not spoken out strongly enough on the issue of McCarthyism. You see, I think that McCarthyism is an issue on which every public official must stand up and be counted. And Mr. Kennedy, although he was in the hospital at the time the Senate voted censure of Mr. McCarthy, when he was released and returned to his position, he failed to clearly state his position on this issue. Now, I feel that it is most difficult to put the nation in the hands of those who refuse to state clearly where they stand. I have done so many times. I do not like Mr. McCarthy's methods or the results of his methods. The day that I am afraid to sit down with some people such as you, and maybe 5 years from now someone will say that some of those people were communists, and therefore I'm a communist, that will be a bad day. In America, we must all be able to sit down with people we have not screened beforehand, people who might have a different point of view, and to argue our points of view. This must be one of the freedoms that we all share, and I will say to all of you who might be listening that we must honor and cherish the word free, or it may cease to apply to us.
if you compare Adlai Stevenson with Hubert Humphrey, was Senator Humphrey even more supportive of civil rights than you'd indicate that?
Oh, yes.
The gradualism of Senator.
I think so. I think that Mr. Humphrey and I perhaps were more in line on that issue. I did think that Mr. Stevenson would have made a good president, and I think far better than Mr. Eisenhower, as you may know. Mr. Eisenhower doesn't even read the newspaper. And now I suppose that his habit of having one of his aides read it for him and then inform him of the important parts of the news is a military habit. But it cannot be an effective system for the chief executive of a very large and diverse nation to form his opinions based upon what someone else thinks is the important part of the news.
We're almost out of time, but you are very proud, I think, of the United Nations work with the Universal Charter for Human Rights. Have you not compared that with another document?
Yes, I think it is a Magna Carta for mankind. In the same category with Mr. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence of 1776 and Mr. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. I think it is most important to have this first universal worldwide Declaration of Rights. And I hope that its ratification by the General Assembly on December 10th, 1948 will set a tone that will carry us for many, many years.
On that note, we have to bring our program to conclusion. Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States from 1933 to 1945, thank you for coming to our time and sharing your thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, we are going through this series called Journey Through Time, What Happened in the Western World in the Second Millennium. We will continue the series next week. We want to thank the Idaho Humanities Council for funding this series, along with Associated Students of North Idaho College, and also the North Idaho College Foundation. Through those funds, we're able to bring you people from history, from different political persuasions, different areas of study and science and the economics of our past, and also the arts. And we find it a very refreshing series, and we are so delighted to have these scholars to be enrolled, and we don't have time to take them out of character. We wish we could, but we know that you're enjoying what we're doing. We'd like to invite you, as I said, again next week when we will interview another very famous people another person in history. Until then, I would wish all of you a very good week, and that you would join us again next week on this journey through time. Until then, have a very good week.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.